Thank you for joining us. This is Jim Clemmer, and I'm here to spend the next little bit with you to talk about some powerful new approaches for leadership and coaching development that is going to take us in, that are taking us in different directions. Let me start with a bit of a maybe silly question here, maybe help decide whether you're in the right place or not. Would you like to increase employee engagement by up to 8 times, double or triple motivation to implement a personal development plan, build coaching and leadership skills around natural or authentic strengths, make performance and event appraisals an inspiring event? How about that people look forward to, or double rates of improvement from 360 feedback? Now, some of these sound a little bit wild perhaps, and of course, as the qualifier says, individual results may vary. But this is part of what we're going to be talking about over the next while, is saying that there have been some breakthroughs over the last few years in leadership development that is moving us out of the same old kind of problem. In fact, many studies are showing that a large number of executives and training and development professionals, HR professionals, are not very happy with the results that they're getting from their leadership development efforts. Here's just 2 examples. This is the first of 2 of that sort of research. This book took a look over 10-year study, 6,000 executives. It was a very, very large study done by the McKinsey organization around the world. And what they determined was that 76% of the CEOs in that study saw leadership as important, almost a motherhood kind of issue, but only 7% thought that their organization was doing it effectively. That's pretty dismal, I must say. And it seems to be that somewhere around that single-digit, maybe low double-digit number keeps coming up. This article in Harvard Business Review talking about how training is robbing us cites a meta-analysis of all sorts of training studies that found the average, about 10% of training programs are effective. Pretty bad results. Well, as the old saying goes, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So what I'm going to try to cover with you in the next little bit is to summarize some of the new research, a lot of which is counterintuitive, not what we're used to or what we kind of naturally expect. And we're going to draw especially from 2 Zenger-Folkman programs. I've been working with Zenger-Folkman now for about the last 7 or 8 years. Jack Zenger and I actually go back to our previous consulting companies a few decades back. But we're going to draw from their latest research on the 2 systems of coaching and extraordinary leader. And they have, if you want more information, the newest book that just came out last year is The Extraordinary Leader. It's an update. It's actually the 3rd edition now. They've published in Harvard Business Review. Another book called The Extraordinary Coach also brings this research along with How to Be Exceptional. So if you're looking for much more depth, the bottom part of the iceberg, because we're just going to be skipping across the icebergs here. If you really want to get down into the details, you can do it there, or some of the links that I'll be sending you following this broadcast will have lots more research available as well. So we're also going to look at how these approaches are breaking new ground and boosting results along the lines of what I just asked you a few minutes ago. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover over the next short little bit. We're going to talk a bit about strength building, which is really at the foundation or at the heart of a lot of these approaches. And that approach is starting to come into its own over the last few years. But we'll show you some of the unique sort of approach that Zenger-Folkman and we've been using. We're going to talk about differences between traditional 360s. How many out there, just raise your hand, have been through a 360? Oh, I see a bunch of hands going up. Well, of course, 360s have been around for quite a while, and there are some critical differences between traditional 360s, which are actually fairly negative, as we'll see in a number of organizations, and using a strength-based approach. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about, so how do you take a strength from good to great? What are the steps for doing that? Well, this is really getting at some of the heart of the unique sort of research that Zenger-Folkman bring to this discussion. So we'll touch briefly on cross-training, and then we'll look at what are some of the steps to extraordinary coaching. What is it that sets us apart? Of course, there's a lot of stuff on coaching around as well these days, but what are the approaches that are proving to be particularly effective here? And that'll lead us to finishing up with possible next steps, and also give you a chance for Q&A. Now, how that will work is should see on your screen a panel that either looks like this. So if you're in full screen mode, you'll see the Q&A at the top. If you have got your screen kind of floating, then you can find it around your screen wherever you've put it. And of course, for mobile, just tap the screen to reveal. So throughout the webinar, if you have some questions, you want to put those forward, please feel free to do that. And Julie, our marketing director, will be combing through those. And at the end of the broadcast, she'll be reading a couple of those back, and I'll try to address as many as I can in the few minutes that we'll have for that. Okay, so let's jump right in then to our first topic area around strength building. What are some of the core elements of strength building? Now, of course, what does performance improvement mean to most people? Well, of course, what it means to most people is fix weaknesses. Look at gaps, training needs analysis, focused on gaps. Where are the deficiencies? How do we fix the problems? We want to, hopefully over the next few minutes, I can start to pull you a little bit apart from that idea. And we'll talk a bit about how, yes, there are times when we do want to focus on weaknesses, but we're really going to qualify and really narrow down those times. Well, if we look back at a little bit of quick historical perspective, of course, almost every modern leadership technique can trace itself back to the father of modern management, who left behind quite a legacy. And he wrote a book years ago that was called The Effective Executive. I just reread it a while back and found it as relevant today as ever. In the book, he devoted an entire chapter around strength building. And of course, that was a theme throughout much of his life, throughout much of his work. And here's part of what he said in that chapter. He talks about how we can't build performance on weaknesses. We can only build on strengths. He even calls it foolish and irresponsible to focus on weaknesses, a misuse of a human resource, because all it really is a limitation. And how do you build on limitations? Now, a little more recently, Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania has been at the forefront of a movement called positive psychology, which has really revolutionized a lot of thinking around psychological approaches. And he's written a series of books. This is one of them, Authentic Happiness. A more recent one is called Flourish. But I'm drawing from this book to pull out this thought particularly. He and his colleagues now have a large mountain of research. Over 4 million people have been through their Strengthfinder, their signature strengths process, or VIA, values in action process. And he's come to strongly believe that you shouldn't really spend a lot of time correcting weaknesses, that the highest success in living and the deepest satisfaction comes from building and using strengths. And in his more recent book, Flourish, he expands on that even further. So let's come back to this whole thing about performance appraisals. One of the questions I asked you at the beginning is, would you like to make it an inspiring event? What does most performance appraisals focus on? Fixing weaknesses rather than trying to leverage strengths. And so, again, it's similar to training needs analysis, closing gaps. A typical performance appraisal discussion, spend 5-10 minutes talking about the individual strengths, and then we spend the rest of the time building their development plan, which is all focused around weaknesses. Well, here's one perspective from one organization that's been using a strengths-based approach now for a number of years. And here Mary talks about, this is the Bay Area Rapid Transit Organization in the San Francisco area. And here Mary talks about how using a strengths-based approach really changed their whole thinking around performance management, and building strengths turns out to be much more effective, and that it's actually something that people look forward to. How many companies can say that? I was recently at a positive psychology conference, and some new research was presented around performance appraisals and similar kinds of studies showing that actually about a third of performance appraisals wreck or hurt performance, about another third don't do much, and the last third actually help. Pretty poor outcomes. So focusing on strengths, trying to get away from thinking about weaknesses. Well, there's obviously time when we do need to focus on weaknesses. We call those times focusing on fatal flaws or areas where there's clearly a problem. And there we obviously need to fix it. We need to address the weakness. A significant weakness, as we call the term fatal flaw, to separate it from just regular weakness. But let's just step back for a minute. One of the exercises that helps a lot of people start getting their head around this idea that we do in the workshop is we ask you to think about the best leader you've ever known, someone you know personally. What were their strengths? Maybe they were strategic. Maybe they were energizing, inspiring. Maybe they were high technical skills. What were their strengths? Did they have any weaknesses? Well, most of them didn't walk on water, weren't perfect human beings. Yeah, they had a few weaknesses. Maybe they weren't the best organized. Maybe they sometimes had a little bit of a short temper. There were things that maybe they were a little weaker at. But this is your best leader that you're thinking of here. So you tend to overlook those weaknesses, or you tend to say, well, the strengths I'm getting are so powerful and so useful that I'm willing to put up with some of the weaker areas. However, the flip side also applies. Think of the worst leader you've ever known. What was their fatal flaw? Well, I left an organization years ago because this leader, you just couldn't trust him. He was a bully. He was always beating up people. He wouldn't keep his word, etc. Well, it was such a problem that I really couldn't see his strengths. It shone a bright light. The weaknesses were so glaring that they overshone the strengths. And so when that happens, we need to kind of separate that out. Does an individual have fatal flaws, or are they just weaker areas? So if this were the feedback report showing that there's a significant problem somewhere, clearly we need to address that. And our research shows that when there's a significant problem, the chances of that person being, or essentially the effectiveness of that individual, is at the 18th percentile or lower. It really drags down everything else. So what's really going on here? Well, when you think about it, what's happening is, in the ideal sort of objective world, the world of maybe Spock from Star Trek or Data, another Star Trek episode, you think about somebody who has an algorithm in their head when they're evaluating everybody. Now, this is how objectively an evaluation would happen. But here's what really happens. Something stands out. A trait, either a profound strength, which elevates everything else, or a fatal flaw, which clearly deflates everything else. So that becomes the big question. What is it that's standing out? Now, that has a couple of implications. One is that you don't have to be good at 16 or 19 or a whole series of competencies in order to be an extraordinary leader, which we define as being the top 10% of leaders. In fact, here's what our research shows, and this is drawing out of our continually growing database, which is now well over 1 million leaders that have been assessed by over 100,000 people. And so this is showing that when someone has no profound strengths or any fatal flaws, so they're just kind of in the middle, they're kind of meh, kind of okay, that they're at the 34th percentile. When they have one profound strength, one out of 19 possible competencies, one of them stands out, is at the 90th, then their overall leadership score goes up to the 64th. Here's 2, here's 3, here's 4, and here's 5. So what this is telling us, and what we see time and again, is when leaders have 4 or 5 profound strengths, they're in the top 10% of leaders. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be good at a whole myriad of things. Figure out what you want to focus on, take those to the 90th percentile, and you will stand out. Here's some more evidence of some of that, which is some pre-post tests that have been done with a number of different clients, where individuals went through the process, got their feedback, and despite all of our urging to focus on strengths and not worry about weaknesses, they decided to focus on weaknesses, which weren't fatal flaws, by the way. They were just weaker areas. So the good news is, and it's one of the reasons why 360s are so popular, the good news is that there was a difference. There was improvement when they were reassessed in a subsequent 360, usually about 18 to 24 months later. The even better news is when they chose to leverage strengths, they saw double, in some cases even triple, the rate of improvement by focusing on strengths. Why? Well, a couple things really stand out. They're more motivated to stick with a development plan. They're more likely to be more passionate about that development plan. There's a series of reasons like that that we see time and again over almost the last 20 years now of this kind of research. So I've touched a little bit, certainly I've touched on the strength-based side, but let's talk now, let's talk about what is it that is really different about using a strength-based approach versus the traditional 360. For those of you who did raise your hand and have gone through or used more standard 360s. So I'm going to highlight what I see as the top 5 strengths here, top 6, differences between the two. First of all, I should define strengths a little bit more clearly. I think this is one of the best definitions out of this book, Ryan's book, where he talks about strengths as talents, interests, values, resources, and skills. And so if you're familiar with some of the strength building work that's gone over the last number of years, the Gallup organization has done a lot of work around talents and interests. The Positive Psychology Movement, the VIA Institute, Values and Action Institute, and their signature strengths area has done a lot of work around values. David Cooper-Ryder and work on appreciative inquiry has focused a lot on resources. We're focused on skills, skill building, as seen by others. And so this is quite a bit different than, say, StrengthsFinder. I run into a lot of people say, oh yeah, we've been using Gallup, we're using StrengthsFinder. Well, that's a great tool, and it's terrific for talents, interests. The VIA work is great for values. But how do we really see what our true skills are as perceived by others? Because, of course, their perception is our reality. Sometimes leaders will get feedback, either personal feedback or an organizational survey or engagement survey or something, and say, well, that's just their perception. That's not reality. That's not the reality of the situation. Well, what else is there? There is only perception. That's the leader's currency. If I'm perceived to be a bully or perceived to be super inspiring, then people respond in kind to me. Perception is all we've got. So let's take a look at self-assessment versus assessment of others. So in this chart, what we're showing is the accuracy or the ability to take feedback, to take ratings, so this is self-rating, this first bar, and correlate that to outcomes like engagement levels, quality levels, customer satisfaction levels, profitability, whole series of outcomes like that, which is what this research is all based on, is looking for those kinds of correlations. So what we see is that self is roughly half as reliable to be able to correlate in that way to others, other categories and other raters. And of course, that's one of the reasons why 360s have become so popular and are so widely used by many organizations, because we get those kinds of perceptions, and that can be very useful. And as we just saw a few minutes ago, even if we're working on weaknesses, which most 360s do, we can at least show some improvement. But let's look at how we can go even further than that. So we've talked a fair bit about this first one already, focusing on weaknesses and skill gaps, and how we'd like to really skip past that kind of focus, how it's a whole lot less effective, and how many people, in fact, we know of at least, I'd say, half a dozen organizations where traditional 360s have been banned outright because senior executives, the CEO, has seen too much pain and suffering that comes from it. And a lot of times not a lot changes. They're seen as negative and punishing, and many people just don't like the process. So again, I'll send you in a follow-up email, lots of links for more research. There are many papers and studies and so on, videos, whatever. You can get deeper into this and perhaps become even more convinced that strength building is a lot more powerful than traditional approaches have been. And it's counterintuitive. So let's take another look at differences here. There are a number of 360s around based on a wide variety of competency models. And I've actually helped build some of those competency models before I got involved with Zenger-Folkman way back in the day, where we would take a group of senior leaders and we'd sit around and we'd start to say which competencies are the most important for people here. And in many ways, they really reflected values of the organization, which is certainly very useful, but they may not be correlated to what really matters. And so the problem here is if competencies don't produce results, organizational results, then why do that? Why focus on? Why confuse? Because some competency models can get pretty confusing. There's layers of competencies for everybody, for first level supervisor, for middle managers, for senior managers. Some of these can get incredibly complex. And do they really make a difference? That becomes the big question. So where this research has come from is taking a look at the connections between all these different kinds of competencies. There are well over 70 different sorts of competencies, behaviors, etc., that Joe Folkman has in the database and has tracked for decades now. And this research was looking at, well, which ones most reliably predict outcomes, such as engagement or retention or profitability or whatever the productivity, etc. And it turns out that there were 14 coaching skills and 19 leadership skills which had a measurable impact on performance. In fact, when you start to contrast the very best and the very worst leaders, here's a list of some of the kinds of differences from a variety of studies. Again, you can search these out and the links I'll send and go deeper to understand where this is coming from. But this is contrasting the very best leaders, top 10% extraordinary leaders, from the very worst leaders, leaders clearly with fatal flaws that are at the very lowest level of leadership effectiveness. Okay, so let's move on. So a third big difference is connecting personal effectiveness or leadership effectiveness to employee engagement. Now, many of you probably know or have heard, this has almost become a truism in our field here, that somewhere around 70 or 80% of turnover is related to the immediate boss. I mean, this is one of numerous studies that has shown that over the years. Zenger-Folkman has similar kind of data showing this. Gallup and many other organizations have been tracking this for a long time and keep showing this consistent ratio. So one of the things that we do is in the 360 assessment, there are 5 questions that pertain specifically to levels of employee engagement. One of them is, are you thinking about quitting? So these are questions only asked of the direct reports. And when we see this kind of relationship where a leader is rated at the bottom 10%, the first bar there off to the left, the chances that their direct reports are thinking about quitting are very high. And we also know from tracking this over time that about half of those who are thinking about quitting within 18 months do quit. And we go down to the very bottom, the other end of the chart, and we see that leaders at the very top, highest rated leaders, have extremely low levels. So there's almost 3 to 4 times difference between outstanding leaders and very poor leaders with turnover and people quitting. Now, we put an iceberg in front of this to say, well, the problem here is much bigger than just what we're seeing on the surface. These numbers are showing the tip of the iceberg. The bigger part of the iceberg is not people that quit and leave, but of course, people that quit and, you can finish the sentence, stay. And so we look at levels of engagement, overall levels of engagement, again, correlated against leadership effectiveness as seen by everybody. Roughly 12 to 14 people all around the leader are rating the leader. That's what's on the bottom axis. And over on the left is how the direct reports report their own levels of engagement across 5 key engagement indicators. And so what we see, poor leaders have very disengaged employees. Good leaders are doing okay, and great leaders have extremely high levels of employee engagement. Not 100%, because there are other factors within the organization outside of the leader's control that may impact engagement, but certainly the leader has a huge impact on that. So the kinds of questions that help to determine that are things like, will this company achieve its strategic goals? Is this an environment where people want to go the extra mile? Would I recommend this as a good place to work? I really think about quitting my job. I'm satisfied with the company as a place to work. So those questions correlate very well to most employee engagement surveys. Here's how the report ends up reporting those so that the leader can see how he or she, what their overall leadership index is at the top, and how that correlates to their leadership ratings. And so what we see is, of course, this kind of relationship. High levels of leadership lead to higher engagement, higher commitment, and lower levels of people thinking about quitting. All right, so let's go on to take a look at the last couple of differences here. One is around importance ratings. Not all competencies are equal for every single leader. So again, we come back to many competency models that say, well, for this layer, supervisors, managers, senior executives, here's 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 or 20 competencies, and the message basically is you got to be good at all these things. Well, that's not our experience. Our experience is we ask everybody, all the raters and the individual, to say, well, of this list of competencies, 19 competencies, which 4 are the most important for this leader? And that's, of course, going to vary by position, by role, etc. So what we see here is a page, an example out of the report, where the yellow bars are the ones that the individual has chosen, the participant has chosen for themselves, and then we can see what the manager has chosen, what peers have chosen, direct reports, etc. And this helps us then to zero in much more specifically on which competencies are most relevant. So as Bettina here says at Semantic, which are critical to performance is what starts to really become important here. So written comments in most 360s, once again, come back to our first point, reinforcing fixing weaknesses. What typically happens? Well, written comments section, what are this person's strengths? Great, I get some strengths. What are this person's weaknesses? Usually get an even longer list of weaknesses because I want to be helpful, in quotations. And where do I spend most of my time? Well, I maybe take 5 minutes and read the page of strengths, and then I start to really drill down into the weaknesses and spend a lot of time there because the message is that's where I've got to do to improve. I've got to fix weaknesses. And of course, as we've been saying all along, we have all kinds of evidence showing that's just not the case unless it's a fatal flaw. All right, so I'm going to use the last point to bridge then into our next section around cross-training. So how do you build strengths? Well, the word revolution maybe sounds a little bit extreme, but it really is a completely different approach to building strengths. And as Dee has said here at Boeing, it was a big factor in their winning Malcolm Baldrige Award. Of course, this is a different division of Boeing, and Boeing's been having some of their troubles these days, but this is showing kind of the impact of cross-training. So how do we get at some of this? Which strengths are key? Well, it's bringing together what are my top strengths? So we go back to that slide perhaps showing the top 4 or 5 or 6 strengths as seen by everybody else, which are most important to my role. What is it that the organization needs, which comes out of that feedback as well? And then what is it that I'm particularly passionate about? Because that will help me to determine what it is that I want to focus on. And so cross-training, we often use the parallel of the world of athletics, that athletes, wouldn't say to an athlete, just go out and run harder, train harder. If they want to really move to a high level, to the top 10%, we know that they need to be doing more than that. So, for example, a long-distance runner might do a series of things like this: lifting weights, sleeping, nutrition, etc., as a form of cross-training. So one example we'll sometimes give is if a leader gets feedback and has determined through that grid I just showed you of competency, passion, organizational need, they've determined that they really want to zero in on leveraging high honesty and integrity to a higher level. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I should always be honest? I should never lie? I should be really, really honest, brutally honest? What does that mean? Well, what Zenger-Folkman did and continues to do and update in this research is what are the correlations? So pulling out the top 10% of leaders rated on this particular competency, honesty and integrity, and saying, well, of those top 10% of leaders, what is it that they share in common that shows up so frequently? It's a correlation analysis. Of course, correlation and causation sometimes are all messed up, but we clearly know there's a correlation there. And so on this one, for example, we see that assertiveness, decisiveness, trust, optimism, dealing with ambiguity, inspiring and motivating, concern, these are all the areas where the top 10% of leaders have strong correlations to honesty and integrity. Some of them you might expect, others might be a little more surprising. What it does is it allows individuals, when they get their feedback, when they decide what to work on, which competency really matters, they can then use this as a type of map and look up the competency that they've decided to work on and figure out where the leverage points are, take a look at this as a sort of menu, and maybe pick 2 or 3 out of that menu that they can use to build their personal development plan. All right, so that was a bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm giving you a bit of a drink from a fire hose here. Again, we'll send you more information. You can do lots more follow-up. Take a look at this further because we are doing this skip across the icebergs here. So let's jump over to the coaching iceberg. What are some of the key elements of extraordinary coaching? Well, there are 6 that particularly stand out. But before I get to those, let me just set this up a little bit further to say that there's a big gap in coaching. This is kind of reminds me of that age-old question of who here is above average driver. Almost everybody puts their hand up and says, yeah, I'm above average driver. So sometimes we ask, many surveys like this one asked, how are you doing at coaching? Many managers say, hey, I'm above average, or I'm a good coach. I think I do a pretty good job at coaching. And then their direct reports are asked, how do you feel about the coaching that you're getting? And of course, what we see is almost the opposite. Most are saying, I don't get a lot of coaching, and the coaching that I get isn't all that effective. So this is a common problem that we see with coaching. Well, what are some of the traps? How does that happen? Well, some of it is because there's not a good amount of preparation before any sort of coaching conversation, and that may trace all the way back to just not having had real training on it. Now we start to get into some key differences, particularly, some of you are familiar with the GROW model, which is a coaching framework. The model that's used here is quite a bit different. It's a lot more evidence and research-based, and it's more around how do we get ownership with the coachee. So clarifying what the coachee wants from the conversation starts to become really important. Looking at airtime. So how much are we telling versus asking is critical. Are we offering advice or jumping into solutions way too early before we've really looked at multiple potential root causes or even brainstormed possible alternatives? And then because of doing all of that, do we jump in and not really get strong commitment to change? So again, back to ownership. The coachee doesn't really feel a strong degree of ownership. Therefore, there's very little follow-through and follow-up. One thing that frustrates many managers is I keep asking, well, how come that wasn't done? And I thought we agreed, and it just keeps not happening. Well, maybe it's because the manager is really asking, how's my plan working out for you? Rather than how's your plan working out for you? So how do we avoid some of that? Well, One is to be much clearer about what coaching is. I think this next chart is an incredibly useful way of distinguishing all three of these approaches for development are extremely useful, legitimate, and used all the time. One, of course, is training. That's a highly useful way to help people develop. Mentoring, giving my experience, passing along advice. Here's what I would do, here's what I've learned, all very useful. But coaching, as we talk about coaching, which is quite a bit different than sports coaching or grow type coaching or many other kind of coaching approaches, is to make it more of a conversation, a mutual discovery, a mutual learning kind of conversation. And where the coach is doing more facilitating of the conversation and less directing or training or mentoring. So that we see as one of the important steps to extraordinary coaching. Another is to help the coach understand the impact of effective coaching. And so here's one of a couple of charts, many charts actually we have. We go back to employee commitment again, this time zeroing in specifically on one competency of coaching, which in our framework is called develops others. So that competency of developing others. And what we see is even sharper differences than we saw in previous charts between the very worst coaches, way over on the left, the tiny little bar, and the very best coaches, way over on the right, the very tall bar. Look at the difference between those two bars. And even in between, when you start to look at the middle, an average coach, an okay coach is doing okay, but an outstanding coach has, and even an 80th percentile coach, has a high impact on levels of employee commitment. And here's one example of one of those questions. Is this a place where people want to go the extra mile? So what percentage of people are willing to go the extra mile? These are all people who scored a 5 out of 5. So what we see is that despite very bad coaching, some people still are ready to give it a 5 out of 5, just go that extra mile. But most people are highly influenced by the level of coaching they receive, particularly, again, when we look at the two bars off to the right, the impact of high-level coaching on going the extra mile or volunteerism or discretionary effort. All right, third step we found is to use a coaching framework, to have a little bit of a checklist perhaps, or it's not meant to be a script or a cage as such, but is to say, here's some steps. So if I just spend a few minutes and think about these steps before my conversation, or if I have this in the back of my mind during my conversation, it can have a major impact. So Sanger Folkman has developed through a lot of their research something called the FUEL model, which is a 4-step process. It starts with framing the conversation, not the problem, not the issue. What do we want out of this conversation? And what does the coachee particularly want out of this conversation, even if the coach is the one who initiated the conversation? Then really understanding the current state. This step gets jumped over many times, and we jump into the next step. But here we really problem solve, do some root cause analysis, really take a deeper look, and try to understand what's really going on. We're both learning from this. Then we explore alternatives. And research clearly shows if you need to come up with at least 3 alternatives in order to find the best one. And then we're ready to move ahead, to lay out a plan. Again, ideally owned by the coachee. So the approach that Sanger Folkman has used has been based on a lot of research from a wide variety of disciplines like counseling, social work, various kinds of coaching situations, career coaching, etc. And this is one of the papers that, again, you're welcome to take a look at a little bit later on, that looks a little more deeply at that research behind this model, the FUEL model. And so building skills then around each step of the model. So what are we trying to achieve? So here's a coaching guide that's often used. Is what are we trying to do with framing the conversation? Well, a few ideas on the left. How might we do that? Well, here are some questions or some approaches that could be used on the right. and so on down through. So helping and walking through step by step, helping coaches understand, see examples, take some of their own real situations and apply them in their own situations so that they can start to truly build skills around coaching. And ideally what this is leading towards is strengthening overall collaboration so that we do have more of a mutual discovery kind of process so that it is a manager. Here's our attempt to try to summarize, well, really all of this around coaching, but certainly that collaborative kind of approach where a good manager might be pushing or directing or jumping in and solving problems and giving feedback and fixing weaknesses and so on. And so that's kind of the middle of the charts that I've been showing you all along here. So this is not a poor manager. This is not a manager with fatal flaws. This is a manager that's doing okay versus a great leader who draws out, who pulls from, who takes much more of a mutual kind of approach, who energizes, who inspires higher levels of performance. So of course this is what we're aiming at, and this is what the research shows outstanding coaches or outstanding leaders do, and what really sets them apart. All right, well, we're moving right along here. We've gone through at a pretty quick clip, skipped across all these different icebergs, and at this point we're ready to start to momentarily take some questions. So I'll again suggest that if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please go ahead and put those in while I talk a bit about next steps and just where you might go with all of this. I've mentioned that there will be a follow-up email coming out to whoever has registered. If you're in a group of people and one of you has registered, you'll be getting the email with copies of today's slides and a link to be able to view this presentation again, archive. And then you'll also find a series of links to sections of our website where you can peruse and figure out which ones you're most interested in, which areas of research perhaps that I've covered you might want to get deeper into, etc. And then what some of the follow-up options are, one of which is a workshop coming up that I'll be facilitating in Mississauga. We only do really one series of workshops a year in Canada because most of this material is done either one-on-one, I'll show you the options here in a moment, or in-house workshops. So once a year we do some public sessions. So these are the two that are coming up in Mississauga, just close to the Toronto airport on March 2nd and 3rd. And of course there'll be information on that I want to send you. So in terms of options, in-house is oftentimes done with first the 360 assessment. Now this is looking specifically at the leader, the extraordinary leader. So then there's a one-day workshop where the individual gets feedback and then puts their personal development plan together. And then there's a couple of follow-up options from there. A process called Pulse Check, where individuals can go back to the raters, usually a couple months later, how am I doing, or have some follow-up coaching either from our organization, or we have a couple of clients that have set up peer coaching groups within their organization, and we can help you set some of that up. Another option might be to have an introductory workshop, either by in person or webinar, and then sometimes perhaps this is sort of an optional interim step, linking into career objectives, and then doing the 360 and following up with coaching follow-up sessions. So that's another possible way of approaching applying the extraordinary leader. And a third way is strictly one-on-one, where an individual does some reading, some webinar, video kind of introduction, a bit along the lines of what we've been doing here, does their assessment, gets the feedback, is guided through an analysis of that feedback, and then there's usually it's 2 hours, 90 minutes to 2 hours, often done by phone, where the individual now decides what to work on and starts building a personal development plan using the cross-training kind of approach. And again, there's some follow-up options there. So this kind of approach has been used with a wide variety of organizations. Here's one organization that Queen's University, the provost there, who's now retired, Alan Harrison, talked about how he found particularly the Competency Companion Development Guide, which is part of Crosstraining, was enormously useful, and his only regret was that he hadn't done this a whole lot sooner. In fact, Jack Zenger just recently wrote a column in Forbes magazine about how a lot of organizations are not doing development early enough or soon enough. Okay, so at this point we'll pause for questions, and I'll allow Julie to cut in here.
Okay, hi there. We have some questions. The first one is, what is the impact of personality traits on leadership skills?
Well, and that's where the slide that I showed earlier on that talked about different kinds of strengths. And so Gallup, for example, does a great job of helping individuals learn some of their talents, some of their natural sort of personality. There's DISC and all kinds of different models around. And we find that it doesn't really have a lot of impact in measurable sorts of ways on engagement, because it depends to a large extent on the relevance of who the individual is leading. So for example, in a very technical environment, very technical leaders clearly need to be focused more on analytical skills than necessarily outstanding communication or charisma. Charisma is one of those personality traits that actually in some studies have shown a negative correlation to leadership effectiveness. So there's some surprising counterintuitive research that shows that yes, personality traits can be useful for me to know myself, know what my personality is, know what my strengths are, know what my tendencies are, and then to try to figure out how can I adjust that to the people that I'm leading. But getting feedback then on how I'm perceived by others starts to become enormously useful, and I can then try to figure out how to meld my personality or my traits around the sort of feedback that I'm getting to leverage the strengths that I want to leverage.
Okay, next question. Is it possible that organizations tend to focus on weaknesses because managers are more interested or inclined toward fixing things they don't like about a person rather than accepting the person for who they are and building strengths?
Absolutely, I would say it's very possible. It's a complicated thing. Why do we focus on weaknesses? There's been a lot of studies. The neuroscience area has looked at this quite a bit. We seem to be hardwired, going back thousands, even millions of years, to notice exceptions, what's wrong, problems, etc. So that's part of it. I think what I'm hearing a little bit in this question as well is that some managers have a sort of a set of values that is looking for how to, the way one organization put it is we had to learn how to change our performance appraisal from spank, rank, and yank to focusing on strengths and how to leverage and use those strengths. And again, so much research now is showing that that's a lot more energizing for both people to have a strengths-based conversation, with the caveat, unless there's an issue that needs to be addressed. If there is a fatal flaw that the manager has seen in the individual, that clearly needs to be addressed. Now, hopefully it's addressed skillfully, using something like the fuel model and done with some good coaching, but it clearly needs to be addressed. But our experience is that only about 30% of the time is that the case, that 70% of the time people have weaker areas but not fatal flaws, and so we can help them leverage those strengths.
Okay, we'd like to use a strengths-based approach but have our own competency model and don't want to do a 360.
Well, there are some applications available. There's something called leveraging leadership strengths that Zenger Folkman has developed, which is not based on a 360 and can be used as a way of leveraging mostly self-assessment or potentially taking other 360 data that the organization may have or the individual may have received and using that. There are also simplified versions of some of what I've gone through here that can be adapted or cross-connected to existing competency models.
Okay, how do you talk with clients about the additional time it can take to coach versus instruct in a management situation?
Yeah, and well, I think there's a couple of responses to that. One is that, of course, you can pay now or pay later, and sometimes there's a false economy there, thinking that I'm saving time by just doing it myself now or just fixing the problem at the moment, when in fact that may, over the long term, be just adding more and more time that I need because I have to keep going back and doing that all the time. The other part of it then is how can I build the capabilities. It's back to some of the coaching approaches. How can I build capabilities in others so that they can start to recognize more early on how they can, and maybe have the confidence as well, to address issues on their own rather than bringing them to the manager.
Okay. If only focusing on strengths or fatal flaws, how would this feed into a professional development plan? There are times where people may just be missing a competency or skill to move to the next level. Absolutely,
there are times like that. And in fact, I would say that the time that we see fatal flaws, when we see fatal flaws, a vast majority of the time they're in the so-called soft skills, people skills, emotional intelligence skills. And a lot of times, especially if the individual's never had a 360 before, they may be quite surprised, even shocked, to learn that they have some of that. So our approach is to say, first question is my feedback telling me that I have a fatal flaw? And if I do, then I need to build my personal development plan around fixing that. But in most cases, it's not a fatal flaw, it's just weaker areas. But I'm so tempted and so conditioned, we're all so conditioned to look at what's wrong and try to fix those things. Whereas this approach is saying, well, if it's not a fatal flaw, then I need to resist that temptation of the dark side and I need to focus on leveraging my strengths. And that will make a much more powerful development plan. We have a bunch of research where we've asked participants over time how much effort they put in their plan, how many people they involved in their plan, what they felt was the quality of their development plan. And we've asked people that were working on weaknesses versus those working on strengths. And as a pre-post data that I showed earlier, the number of people working on strengths reported higher levels of quality of their personal development plan and follow through and so on than those who are working on weaknesses.
Okay, one person is confused on how you leverage strengths. For example, if I were strong in a number of competencies, what would it look like to leverage those strengths?
Sure. Well, I'll give you an example of a person I was coaching a while ago who was in an organization where he had an outward-facing role. It was a public sector organization, and his role was more community kind of service and focus and partnerships and so on. And when he got his feedback, he saw that he had a couple of different strengths, no fatal flaws. One of his strengths was around communication skills, and it also, when he did that grid of the overlay, the diagram I showed earlier, the overlay between passion, competency, and skills, when he did that grid, he saw that communication was one of the key strengths that ended up in the middle. So before we even got started too much further along, he says, but Jim, I've been through Toastmasters, I've had feedback on my written communication, I've been to classes on communication, so I hope you don't have me do any of that stuff. Well, of course, that's what we would call linear development, where we just do more of the same, only harder, faster, more of it. It's kind of like that honesty example, just never lie, be brutally honest, etc. Cross-training says, well, let's look for the leverage points. So we looked at the research showing for that particular competency that strategic perspective was one. There was about 10 of them altogether, but he chose strategic perspective. He chose develops others as two key points where if he could help to make sure his communication were more strategic, the vision, where we're going, the purpose, the why of our organization, and if he could help develop other people to develop some of that or just help them reach their goals, some of the coaching that I talked to earlier, that he would be rated as a stronger communicator. And that turned out to be the case. That 18, 24 months later, working on those things, he was able to elevate his overall score, because these things move up in lockstep together, and was able to be seen as a stronger communicator. Maybe one more question, Julie, and then we'll wrap things up.
Okay. Do you have a view on the effectiveness of 360 online tools as opposed to in-person conversations to gain input and feedback?
Yeah, 360 online tools are oftentimes more honest, less filtered. When it's in person, it's going to depend heavily on the relationship between the person asking for feedback and the person giving the feedback. One of my earlier books called Moose on the Table was about having open conversations and addressing the moose or the elephant in the room or whatever the case may be. Ideally, strong leaders have good open relationships, but even in those kinds of environments where there is a fair bit of openness and there is real courageous conversations going on, having unfiltered 360 feedback that's done anonymously so that people feel they can be completely honest without any repercussions can, if nothing else, just provide a bit of a check against, is my impression or is my sense of how I'm doing truly being borne out by this kind of feedback, or is there a little bit of a misalignment there? All right, well, thank you. Thank you for that, Julie, and thank you for your questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will be following through. You will be getting an email that will have a series of links and other follow-up material to it, some of the follow-up options that we mentioned, and we'll look forward to hearing back from you. So in closing, what I'll say is, first of all, thank you for joining us, and come back to leave with some thoughts from Peter Drucker, who I quoted from earlier on, and that book on the effective executive and that chapter on strengths, just one more quote out of that. He talks about the effective executive makes strengths productive. You can't really build on weaknesses. He called strengths the true opportunities and the unique purpose of the organization. And that we had a bit of a taste where we did the short little exercise around towering strengths, outstanding leaders that you've known, how they can help to make weaker areas less relevant. Unless it's a fatal flaw, that changes the equation. But otherwise, we can help to overlook or not worry so much about the weaker areas. So Drucker says that we should feed the opportunities and starve the problems. So being a little bit of a Star Wars fan, I would suggest that you go forth and feed those opportunities, and may the force of strength be with you. Thanks again for joining us.